All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Jones. I work for Bonneville Power BPA Transmission. I'm in our long-term commercial planning organization, along with Anders. I work pretty closely with Anders. And today I wanted to just run through a high-level overview of how Bonneville responds to transmission service requests and the types of service that Bonneville offers, and touch a little bit on kind of the theme of planning in the long-term horizon versus kind of actual transmission usage and some of the disparity there. So you can keep going. Okay, so BPA, a little bit about BPA transmission for folks that maybe aren't as in the know on wholesale transmission service. We at BPA provide wholesale transmission service under our open access transmission tariff and supporting business practices. Hopefully folks are at least somewhat familiar with the open access transmission tariff concept, but if you're not, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission outlines kind of standardized terms for service and transmission rates in their pro forma open access transmission tariff. And Bonneville, while not subject to FERC jurisdiction, we try as close as possible to adhere to the FERC pro forma tariff. And as it relates to transmission requests and new customers submitting service requests to us, this really means that we have, like all other wholesale transmission providers, a 30-day response requirement when we get a new request for service from requesting customers to notify these customers of whether we can provide the requested service without requiring a study, meaning the existing system is adequate to provide the service for the duration of the service requested. And also, if we determine that the system cannot accommodate the request for service, we have an obligation to offer to study the request, and so to perform a system impact study, potentially a facility study to identify the necessary upgrades on the transmission system that would be required to provide the requested service. So the majority of the presentation will focus on this area of responding to transmission requests and just talking a little bit about how Bonneville does that. You can go to the next slide. Okay, a couple of service types that Bonneville offers, like all other wholesale transmission providers under the OAT. That's how we characterize open access transmission tariff. We offer point-to-point service and network integration transmission service. Point-to-point service is primarily for customers who want to wheel electricity across our system from one spot to another spot. You have a single point of receipt and a single point of delivery where you're trying to just send power across Bonneville's transmission. For point-to-point service, customers pay a fixed rate for the entirety of the service duration, whether or not they're actually going to schedule and use that service. And I think that implicates the later part of the conversation and maybe the predication for this presentation to begin with. It comes with some flexibilities. Point-to-point service can be redirected. It can, customers can change where it's coming and where it's going by submitting a new request. And point-to-point service can be deferred, so the start of the service can be pushed out up to 5 years. And this is a particularly beneficial policy for a lot of our generation developers. These folks face a litany of challenges of getting a new resource permitted, sited, interconnected, and so that the commercial operation date is very much in flux. And so these customers have the right under point-to-point service to wait to start taking transmission service until their generating facility is online. So up to 5 years, they have kind of a window period. The other type of service, network integration transmission service, NITS, or we call it NT, it's primarily reserved for load service customers. It allows customers to basically aggregate a resource portfolio, designate a number of different resources to meet load needs, a designated load amount. And whereas the point-to-point customers pay a fixed charge irrespective of use, the NT customers pay based on load served, so the actual consumption. And so it's again, primarily reserved for customers who want to serve their load from a number of different resources, and it provides kind of that flexibility of maintaining a portfolio of different resources to meet their load needs. You can go to the next slide. So in addition to the point-to-point and NT types of service, Bonneville offers firm transmission, non-firm transmission, and even conditional firm transmission, which we'll get to in the later part of the presentation. So firm transmission, what is it? It's really exactly as it says. It's firm. It has the highest curtailment priority, meaning if there's a congestion event on the system, customers with firm transmission rights are curtailed last after all the non-firm customers are curtailed first. A firm service can be reserved from a minimum of 1 hour to 30 years. And a note about that service is that point-to-point service lasting at least 5 years comes with rollover. So the customer gets the right of first refusal to continue taking that service in perpetuity. Non-firm transmission is, again, exactly that. It's curtailable. It's existing on kind of the unused firm portion of the system. It's available in hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly increments. And there are bands of curtailment where, the shorter duration non-firm, if a customer that buys hourly non-firm will get curtailed before a customer that buys monthly non-firm. And so there's bands of the curtailment priority within the non-firm sphere. But non-firm is curtailed first in priority order before any curtailments of firm service. And so that's just sort of the disparity between the firm and non-firm service types. And lastly, the conditional firm service, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the later part of the presentation, but it is a form of long-term firm point-to-point transmission service. It allows the transmission provider to curtail the service during certain specified number of hours per year or specified system conditions. And so it provides a little flexibility for the transmission provider, but also to the transmission customer as well. It is a form of long-term firm service that they can take and receive. It comes with rollover rights, redirect rights, all the other rights of point-to-point service, and they can also resell it to other customers as well. The interesting part about conditional firm service is that it's not requestable by transmission customers. We don't kind of post it externally for customers to see and request to be offered conditional firm service. We offered conditional firm service through our study process. So if we determine that the system by itself can't accommodate a new request, we'll identify through our system impact study process what type of conditional firm service we feel we can reliably offer. So we respond to conditional firm through that process. Okay, the high-level overview of Bonneville's network constraints. So BPA manages 13 internal network flow gates, our congested paths, in addition to external interties and interchanges. And those are the big red lines on the map. In addition to these larger main grid managed paths, we also assess impacts of new requests at the local subgrid area. So lower voltage facilities usually associated with the point of receipt area or the point of delivery area, and less about the main large bulk grid paths that show up across our network. And when you take all this together, the number of managed paths and the local area concerns, a lot of our new long-term requests for service are identified to need a study. We're showing we don't have capacity, and so they get funneled into our study process. Right? Yeah. If you have any questions, please feel free to either chime in or shoot them in the chat. Happy to address them. Go to the next slide. Okay, transmission capacity. So BPA calculates and posts different ATC values, one set for the long-term horizon, which is beyond 13 months out, and a set for the short-term horizon, so within the 13 months from now. And we do that largely because of just the disparity in long-term assumptions versus the short-term assumptions and the level of known information. Short-term ATC calculations can account for near-term outages, other changes in topology that maybe weren't observed or known about in our long-term studies. And our short-term studies, I think, we run a few of those. They range from seasonal studies that are a bit further out down to 2 week ahead in real-time studies. So the short-term ATC values is updated on a more dynamic basis as you get closer to the operating hour, because as you would expect, more is known about the system and its capabilities as you get closer to real-time. Long-term, the calculations assume certain transmission projects are completed. It assumes load growth factors, as well as certain resource retirements and additions. And so, again, the future forward-looking forecast sets a large degree to the values that result in our long-term ATC calculations. And so, the punchline here is really we have long-term values and we have short-term values. And there are differences in assumptions that drive these differences in capacity values. We also post externally for customers as a tool, an inventory map. And so for customers that are interested in seeing, if I submit a transmission request, what's the likelihood that I'm going to face constraints? It's going to be congested, or maybe I'll actually get service. And so they can input a hypothetical transmission request, TSRs as we call them, and it kind of takes the PTDF, or the power transfer distribution factor impacts of these requests, and assesses them against our power flow study results of our latest study, long-term study. And so again, it allows customers to kind of self-score their hypothetical requests prior to them submitting it to assess kind of the better or worse locations of where they might want to either site new generation or request service from or deliver service. If you go to the next slide, there's a picture of what the customer sees when they go through the map. On the left is a tab where they input all of their attributes of their transmission request, the point of receipt, point of delivery, the requested amount, and it shows kind of a scoring of the impacts across BPA system. And then if you go to the tab, another tab, it shows you on the map kind of the latest results of our latest study, power flow studies, with these TSR impacts on them. And so it just kind of overlays a visual representation of potential impacts that the customer might face by submitting that request. Okay, so once BPA determines that a study is required, and we don't believe we do have adequate capacity on the existing system, we offer customers a study agreement, system impact study agreement, and then a facility study agreement after the system impact study. One note important about BPA is that BPA tends to get a significant volume of transmission requests. We have a very large system, a lot of transmission customers. Consequently, we get a lot of new requests for service. I see the note in the chat. Yes, the map is publicly available. It's posted on BPA's external website. Certainly, could see it might be useful for this group to look at BPA's paths and what appears to be loading up in the long-term horizon, because those are likely the areas and paths that would be identified for new transmission reinforcement needs. So like I was saying, BPA gets a lot of transmission requests. It's pretty much infeasible to do studies one at a time. And so ever since 2008, we rely on what we call a cluster study, where we combine the system impact study and facility study, and we combine all of the requests we receive up to a certain deadline and do a single joint kind of comprehensive study, where we study everybody together, identify aggregate system needs, and identify upgrades that would be required to provide the full requested capacity. There are some benefits to it. All the customers get to share in those costs, so not a single customer is shouldering all the costs. There's a theoretical, more efficient sizing of upgrades if you're studying everybody together as opposed to just the person at the top. It allows Bonneville to process its queue a lot faster and give responses more quickly to customers in a timely manner. And it also allows for higher project subscription levels. And so we try to run these studies frequently, on an annual basis. And this allows the opportunity for additional subscribers, hop-ons, customers to be studied and kind of funnel into existing in-flight projects and help the business case behind them. Nothing's risk-free. Some of the risks with it are that the cost allocations can fluctuate over time as customers enter or leave. So any participant's share might go up or down over time. And just given the time between our studies, customers can wait in our queue for a period of time before getting a response. All right, so getting into the study itself, once we have a list of all the new transmission requests that will be studied, we assess the potential path efficiency. So we load all the new requests, and Anders can speak to this way better than I can, but we run a series of power flow studies, scenarios, to identify what's the likely capacity deficit that we're looking at on any of our given internal paths. We run a number of scenarios. It's a 5-year out horizon. We include, different system topology, load growth, generation assumptions. We look at different seasons, different stress cases, summer peak load, summer sunset, where some of the renewables are maybe falling off, but our loads are still high. And so the culmination of this is, on all of our managed paths, if we were to accept all of these transmission service requests, how much additional capacity will we need? How deficit are we? And those numbers are passed over to our planning engineers who identify upgrades that would be required to provide that increase in capacity. Very high level overview of how Bonneville assesses future needs in response to transmission requests. One of the most important parts of our studies is that we're obligated to respect the existing long-term firm right holders, right? So, we have a list of existing transmission customers with existing rights. The last thing we really want to do is adversely impact these customer service. If we accept more service than the system can accommodate in a reliable manner, it could result in additional curtailments to these firm service users. That's a place Bonneville really doesn't want to be in the long term. We also take into account customers that have been previously studied and are awaiting for upgrades. And so, again, we want to respect these people that are customers that have paid and are waiting for upgrades and proceeding through that process. And so, there are some conservatisms built in, but it's all really trying to stay within the realm of transmission reliability and protecting the existing rights holders. So we'll touch a little bit on conditional firm. So in this study, and this is consistent with the FERC regulation, in addition to the upgrades that would be required to provide the service, we also provide a study of what type of conditional firm service we might be able to reliably offer. And so, if the customer accepts the service, it's in response to a study, which means we've identified there are periods of anticipated congestion. And so, as a trade-off, it allows Bonneville, the transmission provider, to curtail the service during these specified periods of congestion, while also providing the transmission customer a long-term firm contract that they can take and they can schedule on, and is firm for a significant portion of the year. And so, a customer can accept conditional firm service. It's optional. They don't have to accept it. If the terms meet their needs, they can accept it and take it. And they can take it under two scenarios. The first is, the study identifies the upgrades that are required to provide the firm service, and the customer finds these upgrades to be fairly economic. They want to support them. They want to continue on a path to eventual fully long-term firm service. And so they take conditional firm during the period before the project's completed. This is called bridge service, and it really locks in the transmission provider's ability to curtail or change the conditions over time. It locks in those conditions from when the customer accepts the service until the project is finished that would provide the fully firm service. That's what's known as bridge service. The customer can choose not to accept the upgrades and pursue those upgrades. If the costs are exorbitant, they don't want to continue on and put any more money into that process. They're happy with a reassessment type product. That's how they would continue taking conditional firm service in a reassessment category, where they're not supporting the upgrades to provide the firm service that they asked for, but it's still a long-term firm contract. But this type of service allows Bonneville to change the service conditions every 2 years. That's how it's called reassessment. We get the right to reassess those conditions every 2 years. So a little bit more risk for the transmission customer, but they don't have to continue financially supporting any of these transmission upgrades. So that's at a high level kind of how Bonneville responds to transmission requests, the types of service offerings that we provide, and what follows are a few examples, kind of real life situations of actual path limits to observed power flows. And so this first one shows for one of our paths, the west of Cascades North Path. You'll see the red line is our identified path limit. This is for the month of March in 2019. And how it changed over the month of March, you see it was fairly static for the final 2/3 of the month. And the blue line is the actual flows. And so as you see, there was a very small portion where the flows reached close to the limit in the early part of the month. But for the most part of the month, there was sufficient additional capacity up on the line.
Yeah, this is Andrews. I could just add that was an event where there was a cold snap and there was a gas pipeline issue that limited gas access to the power plants in Western Washington. So at the beginning of the month there, we had, we were kind of right up against what the operating limit was, but then as the weather warmed up later in the month and looks like an outage may have been restored or the limit went back up, then we had quite a bit of space available. So that's an example where if someone had a conditional firm with system conditions of being west of Cascades North congestion, they might have been curtailed for a handful of hours, but they would have been able to deliver energy the rest of the month.
So this is Kathleen, if I could ask a couple questions on this slide, because I think this is really kind of helping. I was wondering, thinking a picture would help me. So, so the blue line represents the actual flow on the line, which includes the condition. Well, that doesn't say how much was firm or conditional. That's just the overall, right?
Yeah, scheduled and unscheduled, actual measured flow.
And the period of time you're talking about was not necessarily typical, but can happen because it did happen. Is that true?
I would say it's sort of a preview for when the Washington utilities are supposed to be decarbonized and not be using gas anymore. That this is like if we have a winter cold snap and limited generation in Western Washington, that's the
without
for a few days of the year. That's where the
without battery storage or some other things. This would be straight on generation, not necessarily with other tools.
Yeah, if there weren't available supply resources.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I'll try to address Steve's question. It's hard to know how much in any given hour or day proportion of flows are going to be firm, non-firm, and what have you. So it's hard to predict kind of, and it's not ever certain. What we do know is that, many of our customers operate on non-firm. They do a lot of kind of, if they have firm rights from one place to another in the long term, on the hour by hour basis, they'll try and redirect those for marketing purposes or for other purposes for flexibility that may transition from a firm into a non-firm, but they're willing to take that risk in an hourly concept. And so it's hard to really know with this slide here in particular, any proportion of firm to non-firm, unless we dug a lot more into the data. And we have a slide that kind of outlines part of that data later. And then Katie's question, what type of customers pursue firm, non-firm, and conditional firm service? So, firm service is requested by a lot of our customers. For the long term, it's a lot of investor-owned utilities that aren't, they want firm service to meet their load service needs. And you'll see that in a lot of the RFP processes that they run. When they seek solicitation of bids from new resources, they want it to be as firm as possible so that they're not, having their load face a risk of curtailment. And so you'll see a lot of the RFPs calling for firm transmission. And some of them more recently have actually endorsed conditional firm service. So there's been a transition to some degree of, moving off of completely fully firm 100% of the time to, 80 or 90% firm or a conditional firm product is suitable. And so they're kind of moving in that direction. Not, marketers like firm, but they're also a bit, they're able to take more risk in the short term, with some of the non-firm if they have flexibilities from different resources. And, they're the customers that like to market in the real time and near term horizon to, optimize market prices and market efficiencies. So they tend to take a bit more risk in the non-firm camp. Let's see, Stu, that's a good question. This process that I've described is really in response to new transmission requests. It's a tariff compliance requirement. We've done a good job internally of being able to respond to the amount of volume that we see. We have run cluster studies. This one coming up will be our 4th consecutive annual cluster study. And so we've really tried to move heaven and earth internal to BPA to be in a position where we can take in all these requests for new service, study them, provide a response, and allow the customers to continue supporting upgrades or leave. And that's the primary design driver for that process. And we feel that we, have done fairly well at that. Ultimately, it's up to the requesting customers of whether they want to continue pursuing that service and supporting those upgrades. Our job is to send the economic signals of transmission costs to get long-term firm service. And so, we can't really control who requests service or what those customers decide to do when we've studied them. And so those are variables that are a bit outside of Bonneville's control, and it makes it hard to predict, on a long-term vision of how these, new mass influx of renewables east of the Cascades to West Side load centers is going to play out. I would say that this process in and of itself is reactive. I mean, it reacts primarily to transmission requests, which is, kind of an inherent feature of our transmission tariff design. It may be considered a flaw, or a downside, but it's kind of what is required under the FERC concept. It's 100% supply side driven. It's all transmission requests. As an open access provider, we really can't pick winners and losers. We have to, kind of take everybody at face value, which, can be a bit of a challenge.
This is Anders. I would just add, though, that this is not the only planning we do at BPA, and we have some other work going on in parallel, including some clean energy policy scenario analysis that's trying to provide the more proactive side of the coin to complement this work that we have to do to meet our tariff requirements and respond to customers.
Yeah, thanks, Anders.
Thank you, Anders. Chris, this is Rob from outside. Nicholas has his hand up. Nicholas?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, you kind of answered some of where I was hoping to head, but one of the concerns that I have is that, as we move farther down the effort or the pathway to implement CETA and move away from thermal generation, dispatchable thermal generation, we're going to need to make sure that we have the transmission available. And given the time it takes to actually build transmission, or maybe this is a better way to ask the question. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you indicate that there's a need. What is the process and what's the timeline for actually being able to secure the upgrade? And I know it will vary depending upon how big the upgrade, but my understanding is we're looking at an effective doubling of demand based upon, some work that was done by the energy strategy. So I'm just curious, what would be the timeline that would take to actually put together the design, permitting, and construction of the type of transmission that would be needed to accommodate that level of transmission expansion? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think you kind of hit on it in your question. Is that it really depends on the scale and scope and size of the project. One of the things about this process that I've described in responding to transmission requests is that it's actually excelled very well at identifying the economic projects that would qualify and that would be, beneficial, and customers have supported those projects and are on track for providing a significant amount of, gigawatts of new transmission service on firm. Where maybe it's, we need to think more of a regional or these very large, very complex projects. To your question, our study results in the upgrades, and then we allow the customers to sign and continue forward into, building transmission isn't fast, right? We all know that. Upgrades that are fully contained within a substation yard are much quicker, can be completed in a year or two. If you're looking at new right-of-ways, new access roads, over significant mileage, you're 5 to 10 years, I would say, out from getting these things up in the air.
If we're lucky.
If we're lucky, right. Bonneville as a federal entity, we have a NEPA obligation, which I'm not sure about investor-owned utilities under FERC, so we have to do a NEPA review, and that tends to scale as well to the size of the project. So, and Joe, I see your question. Yes, unused firm can be sold. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Chris, I was just going to ask that for the purpose of the folks watching on the live stream, if you could read the question before you answer, that would be great.
Oh,
So if you could read that question, answer
absolutely.
it, and then go to Kathleen, that would be great.
Great. So Joe, can unused firm transmission capacity be sold or rented if not used? Yes. Firm transmission that a customer is not intending to use can be resold over Bonneville's or the transmission provider's kind of open access same time information system, or OASIS. It's how customers request and transact their service. They can post that they have service they'd like to resell. Other customers can come in and take it if it meets their needs. And what you see as non-firm is often unscheduled firm. So a customer holds firm rights, but leading up to the day ahead, they haven't scheduled it yet. And so that capacity is also released as non-firm, which is another way that service capacity is
and
offered.
that can be done temporarily. You're not relinquishing permanently your rights.
Correct. You can resell it for a period of time, any specified time. You could kind of resell the entire thing if you're really completely finished with it. If you have another party that can take it.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks. So thinking about what you said about you find the economic project. So is the challenge some of the larger, more expensive system-wide projects? But at this point in time, we're seeing a lot of support and funding potentially from the federal government. Is that where you see potentially being able to address some of the longer term issues?
That's a tricky question. I would say maybe. I don't think we have a great handle yet on how any of this additional funding might be used. Yes, it's there. We characterize it as an increase in your credit card limit. Just because it's there doesn't mean you necessarily want to use it. And so I think BPA, at least as an agency, is still evaluating how it plans to use that increase in capital availability. So it's a bit unknown at this point.
If we draw it back just to like what makes a project more likely to pass the economic threshold, if the customers would make a longer term commitment to service rather than just the minimum of 5 years that's required for rollover rights, we're going to, if we have a commitment for more revenue from more megawatts of requests and longer term, that's likely to make it more likely the project could pencil out economically, and especially if it's an incremental upgrade rather than a multi-billion-dollar new line.
Great. Thank you, Anders.
That's a good point, Anders.
Chris, I'd like maybe after you respond to that, if you could get through the rest of your slide deck,
Yep.
that'd be great. I know you have 3 slides left, and then Nicholas, I'll come to you after that. I want to make sure that we've reserved time for Amir.
Absolutely. Okay, the next slides really kind of highlight the same theme. If you go to the next slide, this is just a different path, our north of Echo Lake path, what we call Noel. This shows a period of time or a year. Same thing, this path has a more dynamic TTC that changes more significantly over time. The blue line is the path limit. The orange line is the actual flow. And so this is just highlighting that, oftentimes there is excess space on some of these paths. Go to the next slide. This slide shows, for a subset of our paths over a year period, it shows kind of the percent of time that the path is within 20% of the path limit. And so that is the orange segment, is when it's within 20% of the limit, so higher loading, and the blue is when it's below 20% of its path limit. And as you see, there's a number of our paths that rarely get within 20% of our path limits. So just another representation of space on the line. And this gets at one of the questions earlier. We were able to break down on a path for a particular couple of days, firm transmission that was being used, which is the blue, and then hourly firm, which is a subset of firm on top of that in orange, and then non-firm, which was in gray. And so this was on the north of Echo Lake path. As you can see, generally some excess space. The path limit was around 1,500. there was a period of time where the non-firm capacity exceeded the path limits. And so this breaks out, instances where it does happen, where, paths do get congested. And we do observe, some congestion on the line.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, that about does it for me. Any questions?
Chris and Anders, I appreciate that. Nicholas, question, and then maybe time for one more question, and then Amir, I'm going to come to you.
Okay, I'm just curious, is BPA a customer, BPA power customer, BPA transmission?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
so BPA power can make a request for serving a load someplace along for one of its full requirements customers, for example.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and maybe the last question here, what type of transmission are most new wind or solar generators requesting, firm, non-firm, or conditional?
Firm, by and large. We, in my team and Anders, we look at long-term requests, submittal, and processing. That is all firm. I would say the gross majority of everything we see is a request for long-term firm service. As Anders noted, most of these developers request 5 years. That's a minimum term for rollover. They don't want to be locked into long-term service agreements. It just exposes them to more risk. But it also, as we noted, a shorter term provides less, revenue certainty for BPA. And so, that's an issue as well. But by and large, the new renewable developers are looking for long-term firm because that's a requirement of the RFPs generally that are being distributed by.
You asked to be studied for conditional firm as well, but yeah, definitely a preference for long firm.
That's right.
Yeah, and there was a follow-up question, Anders, to that point. What utilities are shifting towards conditional firm in their RFPs?
I've seen Portland General Electric specifically cite conditional firm in its RFP. We've had some meetings and discussed the product with them, and they've now kind of outlined that being a qualifier for customers who want to bid into their RFP process.